When I was a YSA bishop, and I'm still deeply committed to the church, a believing member, people would open up about painful church experiences. And at first, my gut reaction was to defend the church and minimize their pain. I felt that was my responsibility as a believing Latter-day Saint. And then I just felt impressed over time to validate people's pain, and not dismiss it or shaming comments like you're overthinking this or you're being too sensitive. And I felt like in general, it didn't increase any wedge they had between them and the church to validate their pain. In fact, often just to have an active Latter-day Saint validate someone's pain, even if it came from the church they believed in, helped them sort of move forward and recognize that people can mourn, bear, and comfort. So it's not a binary where if I'm validating their pain, I'm invalidating church leaders or not supportive church leaders. You can do both.
It is time for another episode of the Cultural Hall. The majority of this episode will talk about the General Handbook of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and its updates regarding transgender individuals within the church, but it will be a discussion a little bit at large with some of the changes that were made in August of 2024. I couldn't possibly do this all by myself, so I invited in my favorite Richard for all the money that I got in the world. It's Papa Osler. Richard Osler, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Richie Stedman. You're doing good work. Glad to be on your show.
I was talking to Richard right before we started. I don't know. I hope it works for me, but every time I see him, better looking than the last time I saw him.
You're very kind. I'm just getting older, so maybe you need glasses.
Yep. Well, definitely that. One of the reasons that I wanted to make sure that you were a part of this episode is you, in your choosing, in your feeling called by God, in maybe a little bit of column A, a little column B, have certainly in the last, decade, seems like been more attentive to those that might be marginalized within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Some would say maybe out on the fringes, or maybe some would just say that don't fit the particular mold that when you think of a Latter-day Saint, which is unfortunate, that we don't think of anyone and everyone when we think about that you have sort of, I don't want to say catered to, but been attentive to those individuals. And so knowing you to be older and wiser, sensitive, and also able to share love for everyone, I wanted to make sure that you were a part of this conversation.
Thank you.
So if people don't know, maybe they're listening to this and they're like, wait, changes? I didn't know we did changes to the General Handbook. It was interesting when they first posted this. One of the things that the Deseret News and also the church newsroom went to great lengths to say is the handbook helps local leaders take a Christ-centered, unified approach to their ministry while accommodating a diverse global faith. Handbook updates seek to help Latter-day Saints follow Jesus Christ's example of ministering with love, patience, and respect. So I saw that in a lot of different avenues, saying, hey, before everyone either gets upset or doesn't think it went far enough or whatever the things may be, you need to know what the handbook of instructions is. You at several times have been in church leadership. How has the handbook of instructions helped you in your ministry?
Well, the handbook of instructions is, really helpful resources when you're called into a leadership calling, whatever it is. You don't know all the rules and all the right things to do. So the handbook becomes your companion as you're faced with things that are outside of your normal scope of understanding. So the handbook is something I support. It's needed. It's worldwide. It's digital, so it can be updated quickly so all local leaders know the latest information. So I'm pro handbook.
Mm-hmm. Were there times in your leadership though where you were like, boy, I don't know. Let's see let's go back to the book. You get faced with something and go, I don't know what we're doing here.
Well, I remember one time we were wondering in testimony meeting, traditionally a member of the bishopric starts testimony meeting with their testimony, but we have a member of the bishopric that's our clerk, and we wondered, is it appropriate for the ward clerk to be in that cycle where he is starting the meeting? We even thought we'd never really look very closely. Could the Relief Society's president start testimony meeting? It's usually the person conducting, and that's a member of the bishopric, but could that person conducting have somebody else be the first person to lead testimony meetings? So just an example of something we were trying to consider it to be more inclusionary, especially to women in that later situation.
What's the answer to that?
I can't remember. I've been in the case so long. I know we didn't do it, so maybe
Okay.
that's the answer is we didn't find cover in the handbook to do that.
Okay. Okay. So more handsome, but maybe a little bit more forgetful as you get a little older.
Exactly.
Now, specifically, though, I want to get into this. We shared this. You can find us on Facebook. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on X, which was Twitter, all at the Cultural Hall. We shared this. This was the particular things about church participation of individuals who identify as transgender. So we're going to go right into all of this. First of all, for you, I would imagine that in the position that you're at, handbook gets updated, and then a flood of messages sent to you. What do you think? What are we doing? What's going on? Is that what it is? Tell me.
Yeah, so any ally that's in the space recognizes when there are updates to the handbook on LGBTQ issues that it often generates a lot of concern. And so, allies like myself and others, and especially trans people, are, I'm getting a lot of inbound communication. What does this mean? People sharing their feelings, trying to understand. So we're still in the middle of that as I'm starting to read more posts of transgender people process this and more comments. When something like this happens, Richie, just like you, I try to kind of do a lot of listening. I have some initial feelings, but I'm a cisgender guy and none of this affects me directly, obviously. But I try to do a lot of listening to my transgender Latter day Saint friends and understand how they're feeling about this. Parents with transgender youth, how they're feeling about this. And it just helps me as part of my ministering to do a lot of listening at first and validating people's pain.
So does that like you get inbound, I'm sure, DMs and Instagram and stuff like that, and people going, "Oh, I can't," and then are you just like, are you asking questions like, "Tell me more about how you're feeling," or you're saying this? Am I understanding you
Yeah,
that this
exactly.
means this to you? Walk that through for people because I think that's a pretty valuable skill that I'm not sure all of us have perfected.
Well, when I was a YSA bishop, and I'm still deeply committed to the church, a believing member, people would open up about painful church experiences. And at first, my gut reaction was to defend the church and minimize their pain. I felt that was my responsibility as a believing Latter day Saint. And then I just felt impressed over time to validate people's pain and not, dismiss it or shaming comments like you're overthinking this or you're being too sensitive. And I felt like in general, it didn't increase any wedge they had between them and the church to validate their pain. In fact, often just to have an active Latter day Saint validate someone's pain, even if it came from the church they believed in, help them sort of move forward and recognize that people can mourn, bear, and comfort. So it's not a binary where if I'm validating their pain, I'm invalidating church leaders or not supportive church leaders. You can do both. And I think Christ is the model of that as he just walked with people where they were and sat with them in the complexity of their situations.
Walk that out just a little bit more because I do think that people think it has to be one or the other. If I validate that the church has hurt you, then clearly something is wrong with the church. Christ is not leaving the church because Christ would never hurt. You know what I'm saying? Like we get sort of in that kind of mode. Or we say, man, if I don't say something, it is my call as a active Latter-day Saint that when someone says something, called to serve him, take up the arms, let's go, onward Christian soldiers. Talk to me about how we can, what that either that validation sounds like or how we can be able to put that wrestle to bed.
Well, that's a great question. That's why I like being on your show and you're doing such good work. Um, I think it strengthens the church to validate pain. So I actually think our initial reaction is my best way to strengthen the church is sort of to defend the leaders of the church, defend the church. I think that may cause the hurt person to distance themselves from the church. And and they need to heal from the trauma. And some may conclude the best way to heal from my pain or my trauma is to separate themselves from the church. And the church overall is weaker because we've lost good people.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it actually strengthens the church in the long term to validate people's pain. And I also believe, I used to say the people in the church aren't perfect, but the church is perfect. And now I say the people in the church aren't perfect, the church isn't perfect. The gospel of Jesus Christ is perfect, and our church is a work in process to match the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's an ongoing restoration. Yeah, I still believe in the church, support the church, but the church at times can generate pain. It's an imperfect organization with sometimes imperfect policies and imperfect actions. And I'm part of that. I've never been a perfect leader. And so I recognize I may have caused pain in people's lives. So I think if we frame it up that way, it gives us an opening to validate people's pain, even if we don't feel it or understand it, just part of our baptism covenants to mourn, bear, and comfort.
One of the things when people talk about the restoration of the church that until I sort of made this comparison, it didn't really, make all the sense to me in the world. If you've ever restored a house, you'll be like, oh, we got the floor and the floor is perfect. And maybe the floor is the restoration of the priesthood or something, right? Yeah, man, we did it. We got it. Okay, great. And then you open up the wall and you go, what in the world is going on in here? Why was this? And for the time, it was the best that, that particular home could have. Or boy, the technology has sure changed so that whatever you have behind those walls, man, it's going to take some work, and you've got to take some things out and you've got to put some other things in place. And so when I started to look at the restoration of the gospel like that, it's like, oh yeah, no, there is potential to have something behind the wall that we didn't know, or man, I thought that was a different thing, and we have got to gut that out and put up a new thing, or the new, whatever is new is going to look almost completely different than what was there before, or it's just a new advance in whatever that thing is. That to me has helped me, first of all, recognize I never want to restore a house ever again, but also give a little bit of grace towards the church, where it's like, if it's a restoration, that's different than, maybe something else that we might call it.
Love that analogy.
So I want to get right into everything specifically with the church participation of individuals who identify as transgender. So um, I don't know if maybe the best way that we go about this is that we read a little bit. You had mentioned that you had some initial sort of thoughts. Maybe we start there. You
Sure.
hear about this, you read it, and then what were your initial thoughts?
Well, for your listeners that are just like I, continue to understand what is a transgender person, the best way I can frame that up is an LDS mom used an analogy that helped me understand. She was talking about her transgender son, and she just made an analogy to car sickness.
Hmm.
You and me have felt car sickness, and I think all of your listeners have, and that's this gut wrenching, headache inducing, really difficult thing when we're in a car and we feel car sick, and we want to do everything we can to end car sickness. And she just talks about that's how her son feels. And the clinical diagnosis of that is long-term gender dysphoria. That's a recognized clinical diagnosis.
Hmm.
Has to be present for, I believe, 6 months, and there's criteria that match that. And that's just this feeling that how you identify and who you are does not match your biological sex. And so people that feel that, I don't feel that. I assume you don't feel that, and most of our listeners don't. It's a gender minority, just a few percentage points of the world population. But for those people, it's a real thing. And I've sat with enough and listened to enough transgender Latter-day Saints share their story that, this is real for them. And this isn't something they're confused by Satan or making up to get attention or is a phase. This is long-term gender dysphoria, and it's really painful for them. And father of a former adjunct BYU professor, Jeff Case and Sarah Case, were on the podcast. They have a trans kiddo, and they also gave some vocabulary that helped me understand this. They read from Genesis, and they talked about light and darkness, land and sea. And those are the binaries. That's the common experience we have. It's usually all light or usually all dark.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about dawn and dusk, and we can't say it's all light or all dark. And so we've developed vocabulary, dawn and dusk. Land and sea, there's areas called marshes where we don't really know what to call them. They're not all land or all sea. So we have new vocabulary. And those are the minority of experiences during the day or on our planet. But their point is those are valid experiences. We've dealt with vocabulary, we understand it. And maybe most importantly, those are good outcomes. We generally love dawn and dusk and marshes.
Mm-hmm.
Things thrive in marshes. So I think we can, hold to light and darkness and land and sea and just hold space that there are people kind of between those two binaries, all male or all female. And they might be non-binary or transgender Latter-day Saints. And before we develop opinions about transgender people or let maybe sometimes politicians trying to create fear around transgender people, we talk to a lot of transgender people before we develop opinions. I call it the trap of unearned opinions, Richie. It's easy for me to develop opinions about people in a different, that are different than me, but it takes more humility to not do that until I talk to a lot of them. So that's what I think Jesus modeled in his lifetime. So those are just a couple sort of framing up what is the transgender, and imagine you or any of our listeners going back to the 16th century and trying to explain car sickness to somebody who's never been in a car.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They would like, well, I've been on a buggy and I felt a little nauseous, so maybe they get a little bit, but it's a really difficult thing to explain to somebody that hasn't felt it. So people want to transition. There's social, there's legal, and there's medical. And before this iteration in the handbook, there was some opening for some of that. And now there's pretty much, a line in the sand that if you're going to do any social, legal, or medical transitioning, you're welcome at church. You can't, but there's restrictions on your level of participation.
And I want to get into that a little bit here in just a sec, but I do want to kind of loop back around on something. I think one of the things that makes this and other things so difficult for a lot of members of the church, so here are my generalized broad brush statements in that, is that I think that it's easier if we say there's right and there's wrong. There's day and there's night. There's doing the thing and not doing the thing. And, there's spirit of the law and there's letter of the law. How many times have you had that conversation in a Sunday school or a priesthood or a belief society, right? And I think that that's part of it is I think, I don't want to call us lazy necessarily, but I think that it is easier if there is
True.
a right and a wrong, and that's the only thing, right? That there's nothing in the middle. I think it's easier for folks, and so some don't want to put in the work. And then the other thing I think that it is very much what you said, which is just an unfamiliarity. And that can be, in this case, we're talking about transgender individuals, but it can be something that you're not familiar with at all, and you just don't take the time to try and understand it, right? That can be the Republican to the Democrat to the Republican. That can be a person from the North to a person from the South, a person of color to whatever the thing is, right? All of those things we can take the opportunity to learn, grow, understand, or we can just say, nah, I feel like I know, and I'm just going to speak from a place of not really knowing. But I do think that once we get the opportunity to know someone in any of those groups or something else, something that's different that we don't know anything about, I think our attitudes change when we can put a face to whatever that is, right? To a transgender person, to a homosexual person, to a Republican, to a Democrat, right? If it's our best friend from forever and they believe different politically from us, then it really becomes hard for us to go, oh, they're all this, because that person is not that broad brush statement. And so I think that, the very, very important part that you talk about is being able to get to know, to ask questions, to learn more. I don't think that it's okay to just go, nope, I'm good. I know what that is. And then blanket statement it out. Let me sort of get into this. I'm going to read a little bit and you stop me. I need you to be forceful and stop me when you feel like we should talk about something that comes from this. So, church participation of individuals who identify as transgender, guiding principles for local leaders. The document This document supplements the policy in General Handbook 38.62.23, individuals who identify as transgender. Its purpose to help local leaders counsel with individuals and their families about certain aspects of church participation. General guidelines. In all cases, actually, let me read a whole block and then we'll talk about it. In all cases, local leaders seek spiritual guidance, treat individuals and their families with love and respect while teaching gospel truth, consider the needs of the individual and other ward members, ensure that the church's doctrine on gender is not undermined or misunderstood, seek counsel, bishop's counsel with the stake president, stake and mission president, seek guidance from the area presidency, involve the parents or guardians of minors. What say you about that portion?
Well, I support everything there. I think our leaders are trying to do the right thing. I think they're well intended, and I support our leaders and our doctrine and our policies. So this, is just trying to do the right thing.
Do you find, or do you think, or would you be willing to kind of go out on this with me? How many, when there's a difficult thing in leadership, do you feel like most leaders take the opportunity to, with each individual scenario, seek guidance from the Spirit? Do you think that we're pretty good about that? Do you think that's an individual case by case? You know that there are some leaders that just go, nope, I know how I feel about this. I don't need to seek guidance. I'd be curious about that part, because that part struck out to me. And I know it's just a general statement, seek guidance, be in particular to the individual situation, but that seems to be very crucial, especially when we're talking about things transgender.
Yeah, I think, even though the handbook has got clear direction here, a leader within that framework has some latitude to operate. Now, this policy is a clarification, and so there wasn't a clear direction. Could trans youth attend the opposite class? So there's a lot of questions left up to the local leaders because there wasn't answers in the handbook.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a wide interpretation. I've been reading comments about on a couple Facebook groups one Facebook group that I manage. Just, my bishop was letting my transgendered, son attend priest quorum. He didn't have the priest, but he was welcome to be with the young men because he's a trans man. That's how he identified. And the young men were very, very welcoming. And the bishop supported that because there was nothing in the handbook that said he couldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
And now, as you'll get to it, that would not be something within church policy. So a bishops would follow the handbook, I would think, without exception. And unless they went through the process of getting an area president approval for an exception, so there's a lot of situations, and this is maybe why, even though it's painful for some families, that at least there's clarification on how to handle these issues at the local level.
Mm-hmm.
And there's probably more consistency as people are hearing different stories about how different stakes and wards are handling transgender Latter-day Saints and their ability to participate. And
well, I definitely,
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think to that, the clarity, I think, how many times have you gone to one ward in one place where something has been permissible, and then the next leadership in the next place that is not something that's permissible? And I'm thinking of things of far less consequence, right? Our bishop doesn't allow the foyer doors to be opened and the sacrament to be delivered to those sitting out in the foyer, right? And then you go, no, wait, you're missing the point. But in the ward that you were in before, and all of those much, much more minor kind of things, to just know that it's going to be the same in every place, I guess is a way to look positive at this. I want to go into the next paragraph. Preferred names and pronouns. Official church records reflect a member's biological sex at birth. The use of preferred names and pronouns should be a matter left between individuals and their family, friends, and church members. Local leaders should not determine or prescribe how members address an individual. If a member has a preferred name, it may be noted in the preferred name field on the membership record.
So there's two things there, as best I can understand it. You have Richard on your Zoom screen, mm-hmm. and I call you Richie. I don't know. And so if either of those could be on your church record as your preferred name, Richie or Richard, and that's not a pronoun, it's just a first given name. So the church, or your preferred name. So the church seems fine with that. Pronouns are the he, him, she, her, they, them. And those can, lots of trans people take on new pronouns. They may not even call them new, they call them what they've always been. They're just aware of what they've always been that may not match the biological sex. So she, her, I'm not sure the church should put that. I can't read where the church would actually put that on the record as the preferred pronouns.
Mm-hmm.
It put the preferred name on the church record. And I think that's the first thing. The second thing is the pronouns. I think the church is letting local people decide how to handle pronouns and not being prescriptive in that area and just leaving that up to the local level, which I think is good.
And I read into it a kind of a step further where it's like the bishop should not get up and go,
Yeah.
this is they, them from now on. It's a very much individual. It doesn't seem like it's prescribed even at that level, right? Each individual person should be able to refer as they choose.
Yeah, pronouns have kind of been polarized. I recognize it's part of sometimes on the far right, there's this woke sort of agenda with the pronouns that seems that it, has created some fear. And pronouns are just a sign of grace. I put he, him in all my bios just to signal that I'm an ally to LGBTQ people. It's not, and it's trying to be consistent with what the life Jesus modeled is. He was kind and accepting and inclusive to everybody. In our Facebook group, a couple full-time missionaries are in our Facebook group. Our Facebook group is called Ministering to LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. Sometimes full-time missionaries will say, I want my potential LGBTQ investigators to know I'm sensitive and I'm an ally, and my mission president won't let me put my pride flag in my bio. Any suggestions? And a couple of people said, put your pronouns. If you put he, him in your profile, that is a way of signaling to LGBTQ investigators that you're a safe person for them. So there's a lot of ways to look at pronouns. I'm pro letting people choose their own pronouns. It doesn't cost me anything. It isn't selling out the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's just grace to let them be called what they'd like to be called.
I love that. Let's take a break for 2 seconds. When we come back, we are going to get into the gender-specific meetings and activities, the overnight activities, calling and assignments, and restrooms in church facilities portion of this as we talk about transgender and church participation with the new handbook updates of August 2024. We'll come back and we'll do that in the second block of the Cultural Hall. BestDJinUtah.com is the website. That is where you go if you would like me to come and DJ your event. Now, will I do a family reunion where you all wear the same t-shirts? You bet I will. Will I travel to wherever you're at? Am I reasonable as far as what I cost? Yes. Do I bring a good time? Yeah, all the things. Listen, Best DJ in Utah, it's my company. It's a thing I do that allows me to be able to have the time to do the Cultural Hall. So if someone's getting married, you think, man, they need a great DJ. You're throwing a party, whether it's a 50th or 60th or 40th or 20th or whatever the party is. I've done them all and would love to be able to do that. An anniversary party, certainly done those. I did a baptism in 2023. Yeah, we did a big dance party at a baptism. Spoiler, not a Mormon baptism, but it was fun nonetheless. BestDJinUtah.com is a website. I will get back to you within 24 hours with a quote. Come on now. BestDJinUtah.com.
Imagine running a small business today. It's challenging. Imaging and internet presence is an absolute must. Even with that, you're still a small star in a bright cyber universe. Now, imagine you have someone who understands how to get your site designed for your talents and then easily searched by potential clients. Imagine Lennon Design. Whether it's strictly a website or a whole package of logo creation, advertising media, and promotional materials, Lennon Design is your partner in business. They'll test the boundaries of their imagination to create something unique for you. When you need creative, affordable design, let it be Lennon Design. Call 801-699-3022 or visit LennonDesign.com.
Here in the Cultural Hall, you can always email us, contact@theculturalhall.com if you love this episode, or if you think Richard got it all wrong, or you have a personal experience you'd like to come on and share it. Certainly, this is just the beginning of this conversation. It's all over the internet as we are recording this, and I'm grateful that Richard has dedicated the time and also the research and pretty much his life to be able to be an ally, not only for transgender folks, but for everyone, really. And so I'm grateful for you taking the time to walk through this as you see it. And, one of the things that I love about this as well, we're going to record this, we're going to make this available, and People are going to get it. And there may very well be things that we get wrong within this time, and that's fine. And then we have the opportunity to get things better in the future. So I think that that's a valuable part, right? We're both trying to understand and recognize and be sensitive and all of those things. And maybe we miss something. Maybe there's a point that we had not considered, but we continually learn and grow in all those things. Gender-specific meetings and activities. Let me read this portion to you. Individuals attend gender-specific meetings and activities that align with their biological sex at birth. Any exception, which should be rare, must adhere to the general guidelines listed above and be approved by the Area Presidency. So this is definitely where maybe before there was some wiggle room, but now it is very, very specific to say, this is what we would like.
Yeah, and it is what it is. And this is the reality of a policy and putting something like this in place. And I would guess most LDS parents would support this and believe it's the right thing to do. I'm just going to read from, I'm just scanning Facebook posts from our Facebook group as they're discussing this. This is, and yes, I'm feeling this is a mom of a trans non-binary kid. I feel like this is designed to help people feel comfortable in their fear and judgment, not move closer to Christ. And what about those of us that are fighting to keep our kids connected to Christ? This sets us back. It feels like much of this is especially targeted at youth and young adults. I'm brokenhearted over the message it sends. So there's a lot of LDS parents that have trans and non-binary kids that are trying their best to help their kids feel like, you know, the church is a safe place for them. They want them to feel connected to Christ. And some of the vocabulary I'm hearing is it causes me or my kids, if they're trans, to feel like second-class citizens, that there's this one level one level of participation for cisgender kids, and then there's this other level of participation for transgender kids, and then there's this language unless someone transitions back to their sex at birth. And so obviously there's a feeling that, you know, the best thing to do is to transition backwards, but for a lot would say that's just putting me back in the car of car sickness. That's putting me in a worse mental position. And I've actually, and a lot of parents that have been on the podcast talk about, as their kids transition, they get out of the suicidal ideation that comes sometimes with the pain of gender dysphoria. And often they report their peers are actually incredibly accepting of them at the youth level, that they want everybody to feel included and loved, and they're not threatened by a trans youth in their class. They're used to that in many situations at school and other social situations, and they have proximity. People are hard to hate close up, move in, says Brene Brown. So they have much more proximity to trans people than I ever did as a youth. And their vision of Zion is, you know, we're united in purpose, but we're different. And our differences actually help us help more people than if we're all just the same, but we're united in purpose to come into Christ and help people. So it's just, it is a policy, and the church has to put forward a policy. But I recognize for many people, it feels like trans people are second-class citizens, and and then there's a feeling in some of this because of the separation. You read in that and the not ability to have callings that involve youth, that transgender people are predators, or we're worried about their existence around our youth and our minor children. And a lot of parents might feel that way, but they may not have proximity to trans people. It doesn't make, just someone's trans doesn't make them, you know, harmful in society. We have doctors, we have lawyers, we have lots of people in the church and outside the church that are trans that are doing much good in many different ways. So it's back to the marsh or the dusk or dawn.
Right.
A lot of parents come to the conclusion that having a trans kid is not a bad outcome. Yeah, it was scary at first, but actually this is an incredible kid, able to do much. And same with transgender adult Latter-day Saints.
Well, and I also think, and this is probably way too basic because I'm sure that there are people that take exception to this, but I also think that, like, whatever you can do to get a teenager to go to church, if they're willing to go to church, you know, and I know people will take, you know, excuse with that. Well, what? So we just are partying church? No, I'm clearly not saying that. But if there's things that we can do to allow people to be comfortable, and that extends into adults, but especially for teenage kids, Like I think that we lean into what we can do to make that a comfortable, a safe place for that. Because an unintended consequence, I think about this, if there is a trans girl attending with the young women and she's forced now to go and be back with the young men, that's a different experience. And
Yeah.
I can't imagine that individual in most cases is going to be like, sure, you bet, let me go back to this other thing. So that's one part of it. But then the other part, because, and to your point, I think a younger generation is far more accepting and has experience and proximity to individuals of all types and of all kinds. They go, wait, why can't this person be here with us anymore? Why can't they be in this class with us? Oh, we're sort of separating and sifting that way. And so unintentionally, you may have those individuals from that class being like, this is not tolerant. This is not loving. This does not, it creates some sort of discord within them of like, I feel like Christ would be perfectly fine with them being here because they're great. They were, I don't know, valued within that thing. That is definitely one of the things for me that I I I worry about the intended consequences and the unintended consequences with that particular part. Um, let's move to overnight activities. For overnight activities, let me go again. For overnight activities that are for a specific gender, individuals attend only the camps that align with their biological sex at birth. Examples of such activities include young women camps and Aaronic priesthood quorum camps. For overnight activities that are not for a specific gender, individuals who pursue surgical, medical, or social transition away from their biological sex at birth leave the activity at night. Youth are released to the care of a parent or legal guardian who is responsible for arranging accommodations. Examples of activities that are not for a specific gender include young single adult conferences, for the strength of youth conferences, and youth conferences. So tell me how you and others have sort of interpreted that and some thoughts and feelings about that part.
Well, this was never clarified before, and so it was left to local leaders to figure out how to do this. And there was a range of ways local leaders were handling it, and now it's at least clear what the church policy is, and so I think that's probably a good thing. So everybody knows, no one gets surprised, parents, youth. But that said, it does create this feeling that Christ seemed to start with the ones that were furthest on the margins and help them feel full inclusion. He didn't start with those that were naturally included or in the middle of sort of fitting in. He went to those on the margins. So back to your point about, some people would see this as not being consistent with sort of Christ helping everybody feel included. Now, some are going to, there's going to be a range of feelings, and I'm just going to try to validate everybody how they feel.
Mm-hmm.
But I probably invite, people to generally listen to trans people and how they feel about this. LDS parents deeply committed to the gospel of Jesus Christ and their trans kid, and sitting with their trans kid with the pain of this. Most trans kids, this is going to make it harder for them to want to be part of the church because they feel like, I'm using generalities here, they once again feel like they're second-class citizens or they're predators, or there's something about that that's inherently wrong. And that can create so much shame when the church you believe in, that sort of the implementation of heavenly parents and Christ in your life through these policies causes you to feel this way about yourself, and you're different and you're not as good, and you need to be separated because there's something inherently, an attribute about you that's undesirable. It can create a lot of pain. And so people may separate themselves from the church because of this, not because they don't believe in the church, just because it's painful to be a part of this sort of these policies that don't feel like they match the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, in saying all that, I'm not trying to say I know more than their church leaders, or I have a better way, or I know God's will. I just recognize the pain this brings into really good people's lives.
So a question that I have is just sort of a technical thing. When I read that, do you read that if there is a trans girl who they're at the for the strength of you, or for the strength, what is it? Shoot, I've messed it up. It's called for the strength of youth. I had it right originally. For the strength of youth conference, everyone gets to stay overnight and they have to leave? That's how I read that.
Yeah, so that they need to be picked up by a guardian and other accommodations arranged. So I think, obviously, since it's men and women together, young men and
Sure.
women together, there's not an issue with a trans person there. But it's the overnight accommodations become where the church is saying we're going to separate those experiences. So that can be, really painful. One of the things that, if you've got time, one of the things, and this is, we did a podcast with LDS parents that lost their trans child to suicide, and let me just. This is part of the attempt to try to continue to bring empathy for how trans people feel. And let me read from his obituary. His name is Levi Martin. His parents have been on the podcast. He lived in Massachusetts. Levi's gender was intersex caused by Swyer syndrome, meaning he presented as female at birth, although he was genetically male. Result of this condition and the resulting gender dysphoria came with the host of medical and mental issues. In his final message to us, which is full of love, grace, and forgiveness, as well as his expression of the vast difficulties faced, he signed his name Levi, which we deliberately use in his honor, and that asks that you do the same. So here's a wonderful transgender Latter-day Saint, age 17, who died by suicide. He was given a female name. They used that in the obituary, but they eventually, he felt he was, biologically at birth looked female, but he was genetically male. And so this is back to the dusk and dawn, the marsh. That isn't a bad outcome, but how society treats that type of a person, and the complexity of their road. His parents let me read his suicide note. I'm looking at it right now. It's the only time I've read a suicide note, but I've highlighted in yellow a phrase. And he was aging up and had to go out in the world. He was turning 18, and his parents felt that was part of the trigger. I am terrified how society treats transgender people. So this is real, listeners, and these are real people. This young man had a diagnosis, Swyer syndrome, but a lot of our transgender friends with long-term gender dysphoria, we don't understand the science yet of why they feel that way. But it's just as real as Levi, who had Swyer syndrome. And our messages to trans people, largely driven by political discourse, are very negative. And that creates fear and creates votes, but it's the cost of a group of people that are doing nothing but just trying to do their best to contribute to society and live their lives. And so there's a risk of this policy emboldens or empowers some to be less kind to trans people and to feel like they are predators and they are second-class citizens, and we should be scared of them and separate ourselves from them. Now, the church policy doesn't say that. It says it's a policy, but all the wording around it is kindness and empathy and treat our families well. So, the wording around it, some would say the wording of being kind and empathetic and understanding doesn't match the reality of the policy. Mm-hmm. But the wording around it doesn't cite like transgender is not real or a random study dismissing the reality of this. So the church, I think, is trying to be very thoughtful, but I just recognize it's complicated, and we've lost really good people that have died by suicide that are trans. It's a real thing for them, and they're sometimes terrified. And church is a safe place for me. I'm a cisgender, straight white guy. I'm not really hearing comments about me that are negative. But our LGBTQ Latter-day Saints are often on guard because they don't know when the next negative thing. And I pray and hope for a day, Richie, that 9 out of 10 things a transgender person hears at church or in society is positive about somebody like them, because I think that's how God feels about them. I think God loves his transgender people. The church says that.
Yeah.
We need to reflect that.
Yeah, I just think of removing the transgender part from this. Can you imagine if you were at a social event and everyone's having a great time and they're like, hey, it's the time for the end of the night. Hey, Richie, you got to go now. Oh, wait, what? yeah, sorry, your dad's here, came to pick you up. You can't stay, just from a social sort of aspect. No, you're welcome. We love you, but also you have to go right now, I think would just be crushing. I can remember, for whatever reason, I'm remembering the trauma of a second grade birthday party. Every single one of my friends, every single one invited to this person's birthday party and not me. And I saw it going on down the end of the street. And I remember that the kid is like, no, you're my friend. I think it'll, whatever. This is second grade. But I remember crying the literal entirety of the entire night, uninvited. There were 30 kids. So it wasn't that their parents didn't want a bunch of kids at their house, but uninvited, told that I was, great friends, told that there was nothing weird about me, told, all of that kind of stuff. But yet I looked down the road. Every single kid was playing at this party, but I was not invited to be there. You could have told me how much I was loved, blah, blah, blah about that. Nothing made me feel loved because I wasn't invited to be a part of that particular thing.
Wow. And you're a grown man. You can remember that. And
vividly how I felt. Vividly how I felt in that.
And it may have changed birthday parties for you. It may have, there's a pain of that and a wounding of that can last a lifetime.
Now, I don't think it's exactly the same. So for the people that are about to come at me being like, listen, that's not the same thing, I recognize, but it certainly... Okay. Callings and assignments. Individuals who pursue surgical, medical, or social transition away from their biological sex at birth are not called or assigned to 1, fulfill gender-specific roles, 2, serve as teachers, or 3, work with children or youth. They may receive other callings or assignments that provide opportunities to progress and serve others.
There's some changes there. There's just more clarification. Social transition was not very well, there wasn't a lot of, there just wasn't a lot of handbook discussion around that. Medical, there was more. Surgical, obviously. Surgical and medical often are the same thing. Legal would be a third one. So it is what it is. I think the thing is, I'm listening to trans people, the working with children or youth is the most hurtful. That somehow, my existence as a transgender Latter-day Saints I'd be seen as the church doesn't use predator, but that's what they feel, or they're not welcome. So it can be really painful to feel like, and you have a desire to help, create Zion and teach the kids the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so it's just tough. And I validate the pain of, and most parents would, if I did a poll and asked LDS parents of youth, would you be comfortable with a transgender Sunday school teacher? Most probably wouldn't be.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be my guess. And my guess is most Americans have never met a transgender person. The ones that have met just one. But sometimes in our school system, we get used to a gay teacher or a trans teacher, and we recognize they have the ability to teach the curriculum. They have understanding and compassion, and they're just trans. And I think a trans person can teach the gospel of Jesus Christ. That there's nothing, I know of trans people that serve, in church callings and, the best they can, but I don't think we should assume they're immediately not teaching church doctrine or have an agenda. Sometimes we have this fear narrative. We used to have this with gay people. They're out to convert all the straight kids to be gay into the gay lifestyle. But I think we've learned that conversion therapy didn't make gay people straight. So I just think straight kids are going to be straight, even if they have a gay person in their life. And I think cisgender kids are going to be cis, even if they're exposed to a transgender person. And maybe that's more fear that we have than fact. And so I recognize parents want to keep their kids safe from the world, quote unquote. But so I just, most Latter-day Saints are supportive of this policy. The minority would be people that are trans or people that have transgender kids and the message it sends to them.
How much of it do you think, and this is going to sound a little bit like terse or whatever it is, but where do you think the attitude, again, going back to the simple way, it's that people just go, that's weird and I don't want to deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm busy, you're busy, a lot of people are busy, and until the LGBTQ issue sort of affects you, you don't really have time to engage in the complexity of it or I hear stories from trans people. So I think there's truth in that. And so this is obviously just a way the church is, trying to be consistent in a worldwide church. And I don't fault the church for doing this. It needed to be done.
Mm-hmm.
To just have it all written out so everybody knows is on the same page on sort of the what happens in reality at a local level for a transgender Latter-day Saint.
Agreed. A statement that I've heard quite a bit recently, and it applies here: to be unclear is to be unkind. And I hear that resonating as we go through this, right? To be unclear is to be unkind. Allowing, different things or an understanding of something to, be thought one thing and then actually have it be something else, or have people feel one thing and then in reality have it be something else. To be unclear is to be unkind. Is definitely at least a defense. Not that the church is asking for a defense or needs defense or whatever, but a defense to say this is now clear, and the church is saying this is how we would like it to be and to go forth. Restrooms in church facilities is where we'll end on this. Restrooms should provide a private and safe environment. Care must be taken to respect the privacy and dignity of all individuals. Individuals who pursue surgical, medical, or social transition away from their biological sex at birth should use a single occupancy restroom when available. If a single occupancy restroom is not available, a local leader counsels with the individual and the parents or guardians of a youth to find a solution. Options include using a restroom that aligns with the individual's biological sex at birth, using a restroom that corresponds to the individual's feeling of their inner sense of gender, with a trusted person ensuring that others are not using the restroom at the same time.
Well, it sort of comes back to this same feeling that you're a second-class citizen and you're treated differently than a cis person. Transgender man, fully transition, man would then go to the woman's restroom. That's his sex at birth is female. And that is complicated to see what appears to be a man walking in the woman's restroom.
Mm-hmm.
So this does, it's not like it simplifies everything. It's still complicated. And even in this feeling of kind of clearing out the restroom for the transgender person to go in and kind of making sure no one goes in, that's the church's policy. They need to have a policy. I'm not saying it's wrong or I would have done it differently. I just recognize the feelings that creates for a transgender person, that who they are is, they're treated differently because there's something inherently we should be fearful about them. And the restroom's kind of the trigger point of that this all comes to whatever vocabulary with the restroom or with these other things you pointed out. I would say that if local leaders sometimes we have a policy like this and the ward wants to talk about it, we want to talk about it, our ward counselor or family wants to talk about it. On the church's website, there's a church, you could Google LDS Church Transgender. There's this page called Supporting Transgender Latter-day Saints. Ironically, I posted this on Twitter and Facebook the day before the policy announcements we're talking about. I didn't have advance notice, but Elder Rasband taught people who experience transgender feelings, quote, need to be encircled in the arms of their Savior, know they are loved. So often the Lord calls on us. He expects us to be his welcoming, loving arms. We need to encourage their friends to do the same. So I think if anybody's going to have a discussion about this, starting with, that's the best quote I know from Member of the 12, specifically talking about how we should treat transgender people. And that's a great place to start. Another place to start, and I'm going on a little bit of tangent, is my wife and I had the chance to go to Israel, and our tour guides took us over to an outlook where we could see the road to Jericho. And there is nothing on that road that's alive. It's just like southern Utah on steroids as far as desolate and no trees. And you could see the road. And I just thought of the Good Samaritan and the application of that parable to this space. And as we know, the Jew was passed by, I believe it was a Jew that was passed by several people, until the person that society perceived as the least worthy, the most threatening, the most marginalized, the ones we had demonized, a Samaritan, came by and rescued that Jew. And so I thought of my trans friends as I overlooked the road to Jericho that often exhibit superior moral behavior and often teach me how to be a better disciple of Christ and have insights into helping everybody feel included. And they do that in spite of feeling marginalized, feeling demonized at times, feeling like they're a threat. But I wonder why Christ shared these timeless parables that knew that the principles in a parable like that would be needed in this space. And you, Richie, we're called to be gatherers. Our transgender friends. When I think of the gathering of Israel, I think of missionaries in the far areas of the world, but I think of LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. They need to be gathered, not sifted. They're Israel. They've just been a part of the vineyard. We haven't visited as much to see how good they are and how much their roots are helping strengthen the vineyard. And so I hope we're gatherers and not sifters, and we're doing everything following the rules of the handbook to help our transgender friends feel welcome, needed, included, and not just tolerated, but actually recognize that they contribute to help create Zion. They are remarkable people that have much to give and much to offer.
I love it. What a great way to end this, Papa Ostler. I got a homework assignment that's going to benefit everyone listening to this, and it's a homework assignment for you, not for me. Hallelujah. I would love it. You mentioned within this conversation a couple of different episodes of your podcast. First of all, tell people what it's called, where they can find it. And then second of all, when we get done, he's going to send me a few of those episodes, and I'm going to link them in the show notes so people can check them out and be able to listen and be able to learn more and be able to kind of participate in the material that way. So first, tell people the name of your podcast, where they can find it.
Yeah, so it's called Listen, Learn, and Love. And you could just Google that and you'll find the list of podcasts. And they're organized into category. And so we have a whole tab on the podcast tab that says, and I'll give Richie this tab that's transgender, non-binary, people sharing their stories as well as parents. The ones who talked about light and darkness and land and sea, that's episode 568, Sarah and Jeff Case. Cammie and Dave Martin, we talked about their son Levi, who died by suicide. Their episode 631. How brave of them to come on the podcast and talk about that. Another great one is episode 664. That's Dr. Julia Bernards. She did her dissertation at BYU on supporting transgender LDS families. And so terrific content from really qualified researcher on what we can do to support transgender LDS families. So that's just a few, but if you go to that link, you'll see 20, 30, 40 stories from LGBTQ Latter-day Saints. And they're the heroes of my podcast because they are so vulnerable and bravely share their stories so that we can better support people we don't traditionally have exposure to.
Richard, you know that there are 3 questions we ask everyone who comes into the Cultural Hall. You're going to get them asked here, just like as always. First of all, do you have a calling right now? And if so, what is it?
I'm the primary activity days leader.
If you could pick a calling for yourself, either one that exists or make one up, what would you pick?
Well, I wish we had more community for LGBTQ Latter-day Saints, like support groups, or we have nothing in the church organized to support LGBTQ Latter-day Saints and their parents. So I would love to be involved in a calling if such a group existed that doesn't. So maybe that'll happen someday. And
give that calling a name. Let's call it out. What would that calling be called?
We call people to be service missionaries, and they serve in lots of different ways. So I would hope and pray that there's a day there'll be service missionaries that are ministering. There's an off-the-shelf support group for parents that have queer kids, or better support for queer Latter-day Saints, and that there's people assigned to help facilitate the needed conversations and perspectives that occur in those groups. But that doesn't exist right now, so I can't have that calling.
No, but that's what the great part about making it up is. In the future, when you're like, how did I get this calling that I've got? You'll come back to this episode and go, oh yeah, I basically designed it, and then someone called me to it. The final question that we ask everyone is, what is your favorite part of your faith?
Well, the unique doctrine that came through the prophet Joseph Smith, that's unique to our Christian faith, that is, and there could go through a list of that, but it's that doctrine that brings hope and healing, the plan of salvation, understanding of a pre-earth life, context for a wounded mortality. So that is the anchor of my testimony. I just don't say, it's not just a statement of our doctrine, but it's the healing and the hope that's unique to our faith that comes through that.
Well, we hope that this episode has nourished and strengthened your body, that if you're not healthy enough to listen this week, that you'll be healthy enough to listen next week, and that when the time comes, you will be able to travel home in safety. In the meantime, Chris at Alpine Lakes Travel, Rick McGee, Debbie Wanless, Chocolate Cake Bites Podcast, and the Tiger, with a U, will be saving a seat for you on the back row of the Cultural Hall.
Save me a seat, it's sure to be neat on the back.